Welcome back to TinyBlueGames. My name is, of course, Seesaw or Chris, and today we're talking about MMOs in 2021. Now, this is our first general MMO video of 2021, and one of my favorite things to do is take a look at where the MMO market is at the start of the year. Now, it's a little bit hard to rank MMOs. There's a lot of different ways you could do it, but one of the big things that a lot of people are interested in is how populated each MMO is. And I mean, to be fair, that is a pretty good marker of what game you might want to play because, hey, other people are playing it. Now, MMO population isn't always the easiest thing to find, specifically for certain games, but what we're going to be doing in this video is referencing the website MMO-population.com, and if you've never checked out the site, it's a pretty cool place to go for just general MMO news, but it does show you kind of some of the trends in the MMO market. Now, we're going to be referencing their top list for the 2021 section. There are going to be a few games I exclude from this because I'm primarily focused on fantasy, theme park-based MMOs. I do have a few sandboxy MMOs, but at the end of the day, it's mostly MMOs that I play and that I consider true MMOs. Certain games like Destiny can be sort of put in the MMO genre, but I also think it also applies to a lot of different genres as well. So I've removed those. So if you ever go check out the website and you're like, that's not exactly what Seesaw said, that's why. But with all that said, let's hop into our list of the top MMOs at the start of 2021. So we're going to start the list off with an honorable mention. Guild Wars 2 actually didn't make the list of the top 5 MMOs in 2021, and looking back at 2020, I'm actually not super surprised to hear this, because there's one big thing about Guild Wars 2, and that's that the barrier to entry / exit the game is pretty low. And what I mean by this is that there is no sub fee, so people tend to stop playing pretty easily if there's nothing worth doing in game. Now, the good part about this is if there is something exciting that brings a bunch of people back, well, I'd say the growth potential is a lot better for Guild Wars 2 than some of the other games where you have to kind of consider, do I want to renew my sub? Do I want to buy the new expansion? Yada, yada, yada. So with that said, although 2020 wasn't excellent in terms of content and things to do, I think 2021 is going to be a huge year for Guild Wars 2 because, hey, there is a expansion coming up, and the past 2 expansions have done quite well for the game. So if this expansion is as exciting as the previous ones, and people are able to flock back to the game as they have done, well, I think things could go very well. Now, moving into the future, if Guild Wars 2 wants to really move away from this kind of boom-bust cycle, the big things that I think they need to do is A, confirm if they are just going to stay with the expansion model instead of kind of being like hum-ha about it the whole time and then all of a sudden be like, oh yeah, we are going to do another expansion, because I think that really turns players off. It's certainly one of the main reasons I lose faith in the game is because I'm like, I don't know what they're planning next, whereas a lot of these other games on the list, they're very consistent in terms of what they do. Now, the other thing that I think they really need to do is make the content that happens between expansions be a lot more engaging. Now, every single MMO faces this issue. The year where the expansion launches is quite good, and then if there is 2 years between an expansion, the following year is a little bit rough. We see it with all the big games. It's a fair thing to have, but I think 2020 in particular was a little bit stale in Guild Wars 2. The Icebreed Saga didn't really hit home. I think ArenaNet thought it was going to be a lot more interesting for players than it was, and of those updates, there were a few updates that were just there wasn't a ton to do. So I really think they need to kind of focus on finding content that's engaging to players, that make them want to play over and over again, even when there's not an expansion coming up. But yeah, let's move to number 5. So number 5 on our list is Black Desert Online. Now, BDO is going to be in a very interesting state this year, specifically because of Crimson Desert. Now, originally, I and a lot of people in the MMO community thought Crimson Desert was going to be an MMO, and in a lot of ways just sort of succeed Black Desert as a game. I mean, it was going to accomplish a lot of the same things and just include more PvE content. At least that's what we thought. So it kind of seemed like that was going to be a transition phase, but as we've discovered, Crimson Desert isn't necessarily an MMO anymore. It's kind of, there's question marks all over the place. And because of that, I think that they're actually hoping to keep Black Desert going as their MMO and have Crimson Desert be this other thing. We'll see if that's successful. But with that said, that kind of means Black Desert has a lot more staying staying power. And in terms of staying power, the game's actually done really well at putting out the content that its fans enjoy. That being primarily new classes to enjoy the same kind of grindy aspects of the game, but with a new set of skills, some new cosmetics and stuff like that, as well as kind of a really good event to get people to try out the new class whenever it does come out, and introducing new areas to go grinding. I mean, those are the bread and butter pieces of the game, and the developers seem to understand that and focus their efforts on delivering a lot of that throughout the year. And apparently that's played well with players, because people who are playing the game have been enjoying it, and people who are interested in that kind of gameplay have been coming to it. Now, a lot of conversation could be around, could the game improve itself? Could it be one of the top games on this list? Because whenever I play it myself, I'm like, ugh, the visuals of this game, ugh, the combat of this game, what it would be if it could, have everything in it. But I think ultimately, focusing on something else could ruin what the game is doing so well. So I think it really knows what it's doing for itself, and it seems to be winning overall. At number 4 on this list, we have The Elder Scrolls Online. Now, The Elder Scrolls Online is a game that I hadn't played until the start of 2020, and then I went super hard into the game, and then I kind of burned myself out. But there's a few things I learned during that phase of playing it, and the number one thing is that ESO is consistent. They have a very concrete plan of what kind of content they will be launching throughout a year. It's kind of the reverse of Guild Wars 2 in a lot of ways, which is kind of on some level a main competitor because they're both hybrid combat and they both have less vertical progression. But yeah, that's a video for another time. The reason ESO is so consistent is because you can expect each year a new chapter, which is their form of expansion, about 4 DLC patches, which are pretty major patches to the game, as well as, a few odds and ends and different events and stuff like that. But you know what you're getting each year, and I think that really does a lot to shape the player base's faith in the company. Now, the other part of this is they know what content they do really well, and that comes down to story, different quests and stuff like that, more lore specifically surrounding the Elder Scrolls universe, and really giving people that world-building feeling that they're looking for when it comes to the Elder Scrolls Online. So I think the game is very comfortable in its position. There are, once again, and I've mentioned this with other things that I would fix. Specifically, people like to talk about the combat being but I think the players that are playing it enjoy the combat for what it is, and I really do think it is more that story content, that exploration of the world of Tamriel that people love. And if they keep bringing out new chapters or expansions, if you will, of that type of content, for instance, Skyrim, people are going to keep coming back to the game and enjoying it and seeing what it has to offer. So I think it's in a very comfortable spot right now. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 2021, but we'll have to see. Number 3 on our list is Old School RuneScape. Now, I'm actually going to include Old School RuneScape and RuneScape 3 at this position because RuneScape 3 by itself was 8th on this list, so combined, the RuneScape IP is doing quite well in 2021. And that's probably no big surprise to anyone. Obviously, Old School RuneScape has consistently been growing in terms of players and has been doing very successful at delivering what it promised. The Old School RuneScape experience, which I think a lot of players kind of wanted to come back to. And it talks about a much bigger thing we've seen in the MMO market and that we'll discuss with World of Warcraft Classic later on this list. No spoilers as to where WoW finds itself, but the revival of these old games really says something for the MMO market. And you can look at it in 2 different ways. You can look at it in a very sour way and say, wow, the best thing the MMO market could do for me is release a game that I played 10 years ago. That's really the pinnacle of what the games can do, which is kind of sad, I'll give you. But you can also look at it this way. Hey, these game companies understand that they took away some of the magic that their games were delivering to players, and that there is a market for that. And maybe some games needed a bit more pushing to do this than others, but it has been wildly successful thing. And we've seen a lot of other games since then release classic servers to test the waters. Now, it's not always successful, but certainly in terms of Old School RuneScape, it has done really well. Now, it takes a little bit of extra working as well, because you need to understand what you want to do for continued longevity of the game. It can be very much a flash flash in the pan scenario where people just come back, rush in, enjoy that nostalgia, and are gone. Obviously, old school RuneScape has taken the time to understand how to continue the growth of the game and continue expanding the world for that older game, and it's done really well for them. The other thing I should mention about this game on this list, I mean, if you've never heard of RuneScape, this is the most sandboxy of all the games here. It is similar, I'd say, to BDO. Obviously, there's a big difference in combat and graphics between the two, but in terms of the ability to choose how to explore the world and kind of work on different skills that you enjoy, I'd say they're a little bit similar in that way. But yeah, definitely worth checking out if you haven't tried it, and I think it'll continue to do well throughout 2021 as well. All right, and this brings us to the top 2 positions on this list, which I'm sure a lot of people have already guessed at this point what they're going to be, but let's jump in and enjoy the mystery. So number 2 on the list is Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV is one of the 2 King MMOs, the King subscription MMOs, I should say, and has had a very successful year. Now, this is actually the off year for Final Fantasy XIV because they did have the Shadowbringers launch back in 2019. So they should be gearing up for a new expansion soon. And with that, typically the declining year is the second year after the expansion. So all rights would say the game should have been trending a little bit downwards, but I think the Shadowbringers expansion was so successful that it's managed to keep a lot of people invested, and that really does say a lot, because it's easy to drive hype for that initial release. I think players of MMOs just love playing that initial hype, but keeping people engaged with different content updates and trying to keep them as regular as possible, even with a pandemic in the world, is a difficult thing, and I think this game has done a very good job of keeping that up. Now, the other big thing to mention in 2020 is that their free trial was extended to include Heavensward, which is a really big step for free trials in the MMO market. Obviously, a few of the games we've mentioned below do have like full-on free versions of the game, so we're not quite there, but this does allow players to get a good experience of the game without having to pay, and I think that's really led to an increase of new players who've never experienced the game. And as someone who has never played any Final Fantasy games myself before trying Final Fantasy XIV, I definitely needed a little bit more of a push to get into it. And that free trial, and I did the free trial even before this expansion, was what it took to get me hooked. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays into 2021, especially if there is news on new expansions coming out. I think the growth potential is certainly there. And finally, this brings us to spot number 1 on our list, which I'm sure pretty much everyone guessed from the start of the video, is World of Warcraft. We're going to be including retail as well as classic in this spot, but you should note WoW Classic apparently was rank 5 on this list as well. So the WoW IP has a huge amount of players in the MMO market, which really isn't surprising. I mean, Blizzard has come out and said it, that since the launch of Classic, engagement with the World of Warcraft universe has been higher than it's ever been. I mean, obviously no one knows what that means, and we get back to the whole, it's hard to track down specific numbers because game companies want to release things that make them look good, and there's only so much data you can get without being in that company. So, but let's just agree on one thing, that WoW is probably the absolute top on this list, and it's not a surprising thing. So the big things that happened in 2020 for WoW is that Shadowlands released, and Shadowlands has been quite successful so far. I'd say it has, at the very least, proven better than BFA in terms of launch experience, and I'd say the hype leading into it was probably higher as well. As I have returned for Shadowlands myself, I've enjoyed the gameplay and found that it's been more respectful of my time, which I know is one of those things people don't love to say in MMOs, because the mark of a MMO being good shouldn't be how little you have to play the game to enjoy it, but at the same time, you can easily go overboard to where you feel like you can't do what you enjoy in the game because you have to do all these other things. It's a really hard thing where MMOs players kind of like enjoy to make themselves suffer a little bit, but not too much. So it's kind of hard to get there, but all this to say, Shadowlands was quite successful, and WoW Classic continues to be extremely successful. There's a lot of rumors about when we will see the release of the Burning Crusade Classic and the beta version of that. So I think ultimately what they're going to strive to do is kind of fill that hole of that, how I mentioned in the past year, there's kind of a boom bust of MMOs where you have the expansion launch and then you'll have the second year where there's not much going on, but then the hype generates again for the next expansion. Well, if WoW can kind of alternate the release of classic expansions with retail expansions, I mean, they're going to be in a pretty awesome place. I mean, the players don't completely transfer over. There's a lot of players who don't want to play classic, who play retail, and a lot of classic players never want to step foot in retail again. But there are those players that are going to jump into each expansion to get that expansion high each time. And those players are going to stick around with the WoW IP longer than I think any other sort of section in the World of Warcraft history of expansion releases. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays going forward. I think Blizzard is set up to do very well in 2021, especially if they can keep things going in the positive direction they're going for both of their games. But there you have it. That's our list of the top 5 MMOs moving into 2021. If you enjoyed this type of video, please toss it a like, share it, comment, do whatever you like. If you enjoy MMO content in general, consider subscribing to the channel. I hope to do a bit of a deeper dive with each of these games as we move into the start of 2021 and really look at why I think they are so successful and what I think they have planned for the rest of the year. But with that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.